Hello, hello. Happy terrific Tuesday. I come to you from Marley's unbelievably messy bedroom. I should probably angle this in a different direction. Now I know why she zooms in this corner over here because it looks clean. All right. Welcome. We are a couple chapters away from finishing this epic book. As we left off, the White Witch had Aslan on the stone table, and she's like, "Ha ha! You gave your life, and now I'm gonna take over Narnia and kill the rest of them as well. So you gave your life for nothing," which was awful. And Lucy and Susan are hiding in the bushes and almost watch the whole thing, but they look away right at the moment that she drops this knife towards Aslan. All right, and then a couple of reminders for today. Remember, this afternoon will be the last social studies Zoom, preparing for Friday's final social studies test. My class, I'll be Zooming with you at 1 o'clock, and Miss Nagdeev's class, I'll be Zooming with you at 2 o'clock. Be sure to bring your social studies book, your packet, and a smile. Okay, so Aslan, the knife has been plunged. All right. Chapter 15. Ooh, I might have written the wrong chapter number for the title of this. Sorry. Chapter 15. Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger, for with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping up the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time, they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and the shame and the horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they actually hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her. But still, they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass, and they kissed his cold face, and they stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it. And they cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness, and they cried again and again. They were silent. At last, Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at his horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again. They kissed it, and they fondled it, and they wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all the more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we try to untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cords so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, if you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last, Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago, and the other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first, she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last, she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table, and now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. And she peered closer, and they were little gray things. "Ah!" said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts!" And she raised her hand, and she tried to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely still. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan, "but how queer. They're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Lucy. "I think they're friendly mice, poor little things. They don't realize that he's dead. They think it'll do some good of untying him." It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes, and Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chucking sound. It had been so still for hours and hours, then it startled them. Then another bird answered it, and soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. "So am I," said Susan. "Let's walk about a bit." They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared, and the country looked dark gray. But beyond that, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale, and the sky began to turn red. And they walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment, looking out toward the sea in Cair Paravel, which they could now just barely make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. And at that moment, they heard from behind them a really loud noise, a great cracking, a deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. "I feel really afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful is happening." "They're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All the colors and shadows were changed that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. "Oh, no," cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's just too bad," said Lucy. "They might have just left his body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "Who does it? It's mean. Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked around, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown back again, stood Aslan himself. "Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not a, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" said Aslan. "Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan," cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon and covered him with kisses. "But what does this all mean?" asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she didn't know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, but if she could have looked a little farther back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read that there's a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's steed, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. So let me explain that. So there's a deeper magic that if a person who's committed no crime, which is Aslan, gives himself up willingly in the place of someone else, he'll actually die, but then time will go backwards and he'll come back to life. So he really did die, but because of this deeper magic, and he gave himself up willingly with no crime for someone who did commit a crime, then time goes backwards. "Oh, yes. Now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to it to reach him. Aslan leaped again, and a mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and then catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp, so as no one had ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never quite make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired, hungry, or thirsty. And now, said Aslan, to business, I feel I'm going to roar. You'd better put your fingers in your ears. So they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they didn't dare even look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roar, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. And then he said, we have a long journey to go. You must ride on me. So he crouched down. The children climbed onto his warm golden back. Oh, my cover of my book has them playing with Aslan. That's the scene. I was wondering about that. Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them and then shot off faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that. And then take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless patting of his great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar, and the smaller streams, wading the larger ones, swimming the largest of all. And you're not riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even in the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak trees, through wild orchards of snowy white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down into the wild valleys, and out into acres and acres of blue flowers. So they're like magically almost flying across Narnia. It's like this silent patting, and his mane is blowing back, and they're holding on, like super fun, right? It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle it looked like from where they stood, which seemed to be all with pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had even time to ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it was no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut, and Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. The witch's home, he cried. Now, children, hold tight. Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down. The children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. And I always tell kids, think about when you're on a roller coaster and you go down the hill and you feel like your stomach is up at the top. For they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. Whew. All right. So a little background. So C.S. Lewis, as you guys know, he mostly wrote books for adults, and he didn't write this children's book till he was much, much older, like in his 40s or 50s. And most of his books that he wrote had to do with theology, kind of analyzing the Bible. And people who are familiar with theology books see a lot of connections in the story with the Bible. And if you might be familiar with, there's a part in the Bible where God gives him, or Jesus gives himself up willingly, and he's nailed to the cross, but then he rises again 3 days later. And they believe that like Aslan might be, a little bit connection with that. Same thing with like the daughters of Eve and son of Adam and Eve in the Bible. There's tons more connections that I often miss, but then when people point them out, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And it just makes sense because C.S. Lewis was a theology major professor. So he kind of just interwove those things into this fantasy story. So I remember reading this the first time thinking, I don't know if this is a good idea. He is Aslan, but he's got these two little girls who he has to protect. And now he's jumped into the courtyard of the witch with all these statues. I remember thinking, shouldn't he go get the other people first? Seems like they need some reinforcements. Anyway, tomorrow I think we get to meet my favorite. What's it called? What's his name? Ruffle Buffin or Rumble Buffin? He's this giant who's just so sweet. He's like huge, but he's like got this tender heart, and I love him. So I think he's tomorrow. And then we'll finish up on Thursday. And then on Thursday, when I finish reading, I will immediately put up the test for Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So we can finish reading, do a couple questions in your packet, and you're ready to go. Speaking of the packet, don't forget to do your 3 vocabulary words. Answer your questions using evidence from the text to help the information stick. And I will see you guys tomorrow for Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at 9 a.m. See you today at 1 o'clock, my class for Social Studies Lesson 3, and 2 o'clock, Social Studies Lesson 3 for Miss Nogdaves. Goodbye from Marley's Messy Bedroom.